turn now to Rupert Murdoch's appearance at the Leveson inquiry. Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis has followed the inquiry since it began in November. Andy, you had a ringside seat today. What was it like?
Well, we didn't get the drama of the last time Rupert Murdoch was questioned in public. You'll remember the famous foam pie incident before the Select Committee last year with his wife, Wendy, wading in so energetically. She was there in the front row today, but closer to Murdoch, off camera, a few feet away, was a personal security guard eyeing up the room. And we in the press had been moved a few days ago into the zone where the public used to sit next to the witnesses. The inquiry wouldn't confirm it, but we were in effect the foam pie buffer zone. As for Murdoch, largely relaxed throughout, but signs of impatience clearly creeping in. Every time counsel to the inquiry, Robert J. lobbed the chief accusation of the day at him, which was that he'd been dangling press endorsements in front of fawning politicians in return for commercial favour.
I don't know how many times I have to state to you, Mr. J, that I never took commercial considerations. I want to put it to bed once and for all that that is a complete myth. You keep putting words into my mouth, Mr. J.
Well, I hope I don't. It's only what Mr. Campbell here is reporting.
Yeah, but you're putting other words. And I've told you I have no memory of any such conversation.
But, John, there were some lighter moments which Murdoch played along with. There was much hilarity in the room when he was asked about a comment he was supposed to have made to Tony Blair in the early days of their supposed courtship.
You said this, apparently, if our flirtation is ever consummated, Tony, then I suspect we will end up making love like porcupines very, very carefully. Did you say that?
I might have.
Yes.
Those teeth. Well, was phone hacking mentioned at all?
Touched upon only very briefly. We may get more of that tomorrow. He did say that he had always tried to set a good example in terms of ethical standards. He was questioned, did he think tabloid standards had deteriorated over the years since he joined the British press market in 1968? No. If anything, the Sun was in a better place now than it had ever been before. On the issue of privacy and press intrusion, we got an outline of the Murdoch doctrine, which is basically, when it comes to film stars and politicians, they're fair game.
If we're getting into the issue of privacy, I think people in public position, with public responsibilities, and I would even include press proprietors in that, I don't think they're entitled to the same privacy as the ordinary man in the street. If we're going to have a transparent society, a transparent democracy, let's have everything out in the open.
Alex Salmond, the Scottish First Minister, got a mention today.
Yes, sort of woven again into this Leveson-Murdoch mosaic, the rather unlikely figure of Alex Salmond. Yesterday, as you might recall, memos were released which seemed to suggest that Murdoch was offering to act as some sort of political lobbyist for Sky for Murdoch when it came to the B-Sky B bid. Did he get the endorsement of the Sun in Scotland in return? Well, Murdoch said today that he had a warm relationship with Alex Salmond, found him an amusing guy, but in a phrase which sort of summed up his whole message today, no deal, he said, had been done.
Andy Davis. Well, the Scottish First Minister denies cheerleading for the B-Sky B bid in return for political support from the Scottish Sun. So is there more to the apparent Salmond-Murdoch love-in? I spoke to the Scottish First Minister a little earlier. In the email from the head lobbyist to James Murdoch, I met with Alex Salmond's advisor today. He will call Hunt whenever we need him to.
Well, I'd made it quite clear that I was convinced that the case that was put forward, remember this is before Leveson, before the revelations on hacking and all of that, that the case being put forward about jobs and investment for Scotland was a strong one, and I'd have been prepared to make that case when appropriate.
He says Alex Salmond called. He had a very good dinner with the editor of The Sun in Scotland. The Sun's now keen to back the SNP. Alex wanted to know whether we could help smooth the way for the process.
Well, the issue we had in Scotland, of course, is that you didn't have to just persuade the editorial team in Scotland. In previous years, that the editorial team in Scotland perhaps had one view, but that was countermanded by the editor in London. Over the long years with the Sun back to the Labour Party, that was the case. So obviously politicians seek support from the press, just as companies, if they're going to promise jobs and investment, are entitled to seek support from politicians. That is part of the course and discourse of politics.
But this is not just that. It is the fact that Mrs. Thatcher, you, John Major, Blair, all had to go and pay obeisance to the Murdoch empire to try and get yourselves elected. And that surely is a very bad thing for politics.
Well, it's entirely in the nature of politicians to seek support from the press. That's what politicians do. It's part of the process of politics. And it's entirely in the nature of this Scottish Government, this Scottish First Minister, to always advocate first, last, foremost, jobs and investment in Scotland. And incidentally, John, I'll continue to do that.
Well, you get me elected and I'll see you all right, Rupert. That doesn't sound too good to me.
Well, that doesn't sound like any email you've got from me, John.
No, but it's very much the spirit. It's very much the spirit of what you were all up to. All of you politicians were saying, elect us and we will protect your commercial interests, Rupert.
Well, John, can I just say to you, the fact you have to start talking about all politicians in the broad brush indicates you're not getting to the exact point. There was no quid pro quo in terms of support for support. There couldn't be, because it wasn't the Scottish Government's determination on the ownership of Sky B. What was the Scottish Government's responsibility was to argue for jobs and investment in Scotland, and that's exactly what I did.